Welcome to Revolution Against Evolution. I'm your host, Doug Sharp.
I'm your co-host, Rich Gear, here with you, and we have a guest on our show tonight. He's usually in the audience, right, Doug?
Yeah, well, he's a newcomer to our group.
Yes, we're really happy to have him here.
This is Jeff Conklin.
Jeff Conklin, yeah.
We're glad to have you on our show today.
It's good to be here.
Yeah.
Appreciate you and participating in the last few months. And you have a topic that I think we need to talk about. It's called, Why Should Christians Be Concerned About Evolution? And I think that we know that there's a lot of churches who really don't think that this is an important issue to address. And I think that they are wrong. They have to really understand that there's a lot of people who are really stumbling over this. This is a stumbling block for a lot of people.
Yeah, Doug, I mean, the thing about it is, how many times have you heard, well, it's not a salvific issue. In other words, if you don't believe in evolution or creation, you're not going to go to hell. I said, I know, but I said, that's true in that sense, in that limited sense. But what they fail to understand is, because of what it teaches, ultimately it prevents many people from coming to salvation. And so in that sense, it is a salvific issue. So wouldn't you agree, Joe?
Yeah, well, it has an effect on the gospel.
Absolutely.
Because it strikes at the origins of the human race and our problem, which is sin. And how did we get into this problem? Why do we have this problem?
Yeah.
And if you don't have a cogent explanation for that on a biblical basis for a Christian, if you take that away, you're undermining basically a Christian who argues that we can have evolution and keep the Bible and everything else are basically starting to, saw off the branch they're sitting on because
they're digging a hole for their own grave.
Right, exactly. And it may not affect them, perhaps, but the next generation will take it this step further, and we've seen this happen.
Yeah. So anyway, the idea of biological evolution, you got a title here. It says it contradicts the account of creation found in Scripture. We know that to be true. But what specifics are you talking about when you say that?
Well, just for one example, in evolution, you have kinds of animals over time, over many generations, transforming themselves into other kinds of animals, even across family lines, even genus, family, not just species. We talk about speciation, which is possible with the variation that's already present in the genomic code, right? But evolution requires something much more drastic. For example,
from bacteria to humans.
Oh, right, yeah, on the large scale, but even from a water-dwelling animal to a land-dwelling animal, because they've got the fish first, and they were supposedly somehow evolved into land animals. That requires a huge change of kind. But the biblical story that we see in Genesis 1 makes clear that God has created all living things to reproduce according to kinds, according to their own kinds.
One of the things that the Bible mentions that right in the beginning, one of the very first things that it mentions is the creation of the great whales. And so right off the bat, you have actually the total end of things showing up in the first part of the Genesis account.
Right. Yeah.
And so it doesn't really fit the evolutionary expected sequence.
Yeah, Doug, I remember years ago, and we'll get into this, but Doug did a really cool thing. A lot of people try to make correlations between the evolutionary, let's say, uniformitarian, the geologic column, or how things are created, as they say. And Doug, you had a great list of no, this says it was created on day. This was whether you make a day 1,000,000 years or 1,000 years, that kind of stuff. He goes, no, this is in the wrong order. The sun was created on day 4. That doesn't work. You got to have the sun first, based on evolutionary standards. You've got certain things where the birds. The birds were created at the same time that the seed stuff was created. Right. That doesn't work.
And they have birds evolving out of dinosaurs, which are land animals.
Yeah,
and so that's way out of order.
It's just everything. And when you really, it's on a cursory look. People trying to do it. It's interesting. I'm going to read this book, C.S. Lewis and Darwinism this week, and it's really, boy, Doug, some of the arguments we're using today, he nailed it. In the late 50s, he became, there are people who think that he was an evolutionary thing, and he made certain statements early on in his career that sounded almost like he was. As he got older, he got even less and less, but he didn't have a problem with what we were talking about. What they call it in the terms microevolution and macroevolution.
Right.
He actually used those terms, and he said, nah. And he says Darwinism doesn't explain. It barely explains the survival of the species. It doesn't really explain that, but it doesn't explain at all the arrival of the species.
Right.
It doesn't explain.
And that's the big issue.
He gets a lot of things right, and I was just flabbergasted. I highlighted some of the stuff because I was just, wow, these are arguments we're using today. What an amazing thing. But he got become very much unimpressed with scientism as opposed to science. He said, we're not against science, we're against scientism,
right,
where it's become its own religion. And that's a big part of it. That's another situation. But okay, so what's next here? What's next on your docket here?
Well, just to recap kind of that whole issue of the evolutionary story contradicting Genesis. John MacArthur, I have a quote from him, and he says that these verses, the verses in Genesis where it talks about all living things being created according to their kinds, to reproduce according to their kinds, he says these verses indicate that evolution, which proposes reproduction across species lines, is a false explanation of origins.
At least from a scriptural standpoint.
And that's in his study Bible notes.
And I guess that's the big thing you're putting here, because unbelievers, people who don't believe in the scripture, that's why we use some of the science stuff, why we use some of the empirical stuff. We don't use it to prove the Bible.
Right.
Okay? But what's really flabbergasting to me is how many people who claim to be believers don't understand the implications. They're undermining, as you said, cutting the branch that they're standing on, or they say digging the hole they're going to put themselves in the grave in. And that's what's going on. Doug and I have talked over many, many years of this, the idea of death before Adam, just kills me. Right. How anybody can absolutely, and I watched them do pretzels, gymnastics, verbal and mental pretzel bending just to get that to fit. I said, but Genesis does not leave you much room for it. It says, well, it's only humans. Well, how come the beasts of the field and the thorns and everything? And well, it's spiritual death. Well, how come Christ had to die physically? Why is he saying to the dust you're going to go? You came from it. You're going to. Genesis and New Testament even corroborates it even more. As Paul said, from one man came death. Evolution demands the exact opposite.
Right.
From dying came man.
And the idea of neo-Darwinian evolution, it calls God's goodness into question. Why would a good God use such a process to create?
Yeah, all you can say is good God. I'd be a little flip there, but that's, because he is good, he would not do something like that.
And Genesis 1:31, after everything was created, land animals, fish, man, he says, this is very good. And when you really have to do some, like you said, some gymnastics to try to make that word or that phrase very good fit a world filled with cancer, malaria, disease, disaster, catastrophe, all these things. And there's a quote from David Hull. He's not a Christian, but he recognizes the problem of having all this destruction and death and suffering attributed to God. And this is what he says. He says, the problem that biological evolution poses for natural theologians is the sort of God that Darwinian evolution implies. The evolutionary process is rife with happenstance, contingency, incredible waste, death, pain, and horror. Whatever the God implied by evolutionary theory and the data of natural history may be like, he is not the Protestant God of waste not, want not. And he is also not a loving God who cares about his productions. He is not even the awful God portrayed. He calls the God of Job awful, but that's it really. He doesn't understand it. But so he calls it the God of the Galapagos. Referring to Darwin's God, is careless, wasteful, indifferent, almost diabolical, and he is certainly not the sort of God to whom anyone would be inclined to pray, unquote.
Absolutely,
So,
yeah.
so even a non-believer can point out the inconsistency
Right.
of all this to say that a good God has created this type of a world and attribute all this horror to him is not fitting.
The problem of pain seems to be a big factor in why people abandon God. And there's Charles Darwin himself was one who abandoned God. He once studied for the ministry, but he says, well, there seems to be just too much misery in this world.
Well, the biggest thing was the death of his own daughter.
Right.
I think what's her name? Anne, was her name Anne?
Annie, I guess.
Annie, anyway, I mean, when she died, she was 10 years old, I believe. Anyway,
That'd be hard.
and that was hard, and it is always hard. You know, the death of a child is the worst thing a parent could ever go through.
Yeah.
But I think that set him on a precipice, and he jumped off it. And
Darwin continues on. He says, I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have designed and created the parasitic flies with express intention of feeding the living bodies of the caterpillars, or a cat should play with mice. Not believing this, I see no necessity in the belief that the eye was expressly designed.
So he uses the problem of pain and suffering and the suffering even of animals.
Right.
I mean, he sees that as inconsistent with God, and he uses that as an excuse, basically, to deny design.
Of Darwin, though, he sort of liked to torture animals.
Yeah, he was not a nice guy.
Yeah, I've heard that.
When it comes to that kind of stuff. Yeah.
And then we have Charles Templeton. He was once a prominent evangelist alongside Billy Graham, but he ended up leaving Christianity. And he said, why does God's grand design require creatures with teeth designed to crush spines, or rend flesh, claws fashioned to seize and tear, venom to paralyze, mouths to suck blood, coils to constrict and smother, even expandable jaws so that prey may be swallowed whole and alive. And so this is nature's Tennyson's vivid phrase, red with blood in tooth and claw, and life is a carnival of blood. How could a loving and omnipotent God...
Easy for you to say, right? Omnipotent,
All powerful.
Why would God create such horrors as what we've been contemplating? Of course, this is a definite issue that the people have to deal with. Why is there sin and suffering in this world? Why is there pain? Why didn't God just make the things all happy and work out?
I think if people were fair, though, they would at least acknowledge the fact that there are people who they might think are crazy for believing it, but who are basically very erudite, smart, intelligent, who have understood the problem of pain and suffering, that there are explanations for it. Mm-hmm. We talk about it on this. Again, Genesis gives the answer to that. Mm-hmm. And the whole idea is that, of course, you have, the creation because of the fall, because you said earlier sin, right?
Right.
Sin has caused a judgment, but it's not forever. The judgment is, Paul says it very eloquently, the creation was subjected to futility. Mm-hmm. To death, dying, corruption.
Romans 8.
Yes, but it's in the hope. There is a hope given at the same time. Mm-hmm. At the same time that the serpent is going to bruise his heel, his heel's going to crush the head. Mm-hmm. The serpent, which is a symbol of the devil, is going to be crushed. Now, it's hard for us because we're a bunch of short-timers. Mm-hmm. We're eternal in one sense, but we've never experienced that in this life. Mm-hmm. Or we do, but it's sort of like vicariously or very obliquely. It's really difficult. The Lord makes it hard, so not makes it, but it is hard for us because He doesn't talk out loud like I'm talking to you.
Right.
Very, very often. And so faith is, and that's a requirement, and we understand that. But alongside of it, there's a lot of history, there's a lot of facts, there's stuff, as I said, we don't use it to prove the Bible, but they are. For instance, Adam and Eve were real people.
Had to be. really,
Yeah.
because
I mean,
logically,
and again, for
it's
a
a
Christian,
necessity.
I always ask the Christian, I said, where does the genealogy of Jesus go from real people to fake people?
From Luke 3, right?
Yeah, Luke 3 goes all the way from Jesus back to Adam with an unbroken line.
Right.
He's the only one in all history that we have an unbroken line of progenitors. The only one.
And I did.
You know?
I had a pastor who was doubtful about the authenticity, or really, I mean, he saw Genesis 1 through 11 as sort of this combination of history myth,
You're right.
where you can't
A lot of
really
people
know
do, yeah.
if it's real history or not.
Right.
And I just asked him, well, you go from Abraham, Genesis 12, and you go backwards, his father's Terah, and then you go backwards again and you go through, and I said, well, show me the line where these people become mythical. I don't think he ever answered my email about that.
No, they
because,
can't.
No, there's no way to tell. And if you start casting doubt on the scripture in that way, where do you stop?
And that's exactly the point, because in recent years, there's been a lot of pushback because of archaeological discoveries, but they got that King David was a myth. The only time they felt any historicity of the Bible was maybe the Persian Empire or Babylonian Empire, maybe. Okay, but then they kept finding Sennacherib and kings mentioned. Well, they had to push back a little bit. And in last dozen years ago, so they found David mentioned in a tablet there. They've even found, and of course they can't admit this is the Goliath, the Bible, but they've actually found in the Goliath of Gath. In the town of Gath, they found an inscription with a guy named Goliath. And they go, and it's around the 10th century BC. Oh, but there may be other Goliaths. I go, yeah, maybe, but I'm going, I can't prove it's the guy, but I'm going, wow. But so they don't even start with Abraham. They go back down to David and even earlier, but they've been pushed back now.
Yep.
I mean, for years, I remember hearing about how Daniel was only written in about 250 BC because the real reason was they couldn't accept the fact that he was so accurate in his prophecies.
Right.
Of course, he predicted the fall of the Roman Empire, and they couldn't get him past that. So
there's a lot of evangelicals that sort of question the existence of Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
And because of evolution, they don't want to question evolution, and they don't want to appear that they're Luddites or something like that.
They want to be part of the cool kid group.
Right. Like, for example, we have a quote from Dan Harlow, and he is, I think, currently still a professor of biblical studies at Calvin College in Grand Rapids. And he teamed up with a guy named John Schneider, who was also a professor there at Calvin at the time. And this was when they were having a lot of discussion about the historical Adam. And it wasn't too. I think it was maybe 2011, somewhere in there.
Oh, not that long ago. Okay.
And he says, quote, recent research in molecular biology, primatology, sociobiology, and phylogenetics indicates that the species Homo sapiens cannot be traced back to a single pair of individuals, referring there to Adam and Eve now, and that the earliest human beings did not come on the scene in anything like the paradisal, like the Garden of Eden, physical or moral condition. The morality tale of Adam and Eve, says Harlow, comes from, quote, an imagined past and is not historical.
Well, it's interesting that Robert Carter of CMI has just recently published a good refutation of this whole nonsense.
Right.
And
they go from different presuppositions in there, and so these are from evolutionary presuppositions.
Yeah, and that's of course they basically prove that the idea that they state the fact that they want to prove, by saying it makes it so.
Right.
That's kind of what they're doing.
Well, you have evolutionary presuppositions,
right,
and you end up with an evolutionary answer. No surprise.
Yeah, but the problem is it flies in the face of the facts, because everything I'm hearing, even from an evolutionary, they're tracing us down to the one primordial Eve. Granted,
right. Mitochondrial.
Yeah,
Eve.
the mitochondrial Eve and that kind of stuff. It's not the Adam. It's not the Eve of the Bible, but
right.
Even they're realizing it goes back to one basic pair here. And it's like, I'm not using that as evidence.
When you think about it logically, just for 5 minutes, if you just sit down and think, now, we're the human race, there had to be a first two. There was a time when there weren't humans, and then there was a time that there was humans. Chronologically, there has to be a point at which there were two original. And when you get into evolution, I mean, think about it. If Adam has evolved first into a Homo sapien, and Eve is lagging behind, who's he going to mate with?
Yeah, like a millennium.
And so none of it makes sense.
Well, the other thing doesn't make sense. I told somebody this, I said, you got to understand too, is like, we know about genetics and inbreeding.
Mm-hmm.
How come we're not all extinct 300 times over unless we were created perfect?
Yeah, right.
In other words,
genetic entropy is a big
genetic entropy.
Kondrashov's question.
Yeah, if we keep inbreeding, we know what happens when we breed the same people over. All the recessive traits come up and bad stuff happens. Hemophilia and you name it, the diseases that come up there. So I said, I have an explanation how two people could produce it, because it was created perfect by a God. You have to go from natural things that existed in the world. And even if I gave you somehow some ape-like hominid, both turned into a man and a woman at the same time, which you mentioned, that would really mess everything up.
Well, it has
but
to
even
be
if it happened,
convergent evolution at the highest level.
Yeah, and they would have still. We should be extinct, especially as old as you think human beings are.
Right.
We should be extinct 300 times over.
Yep.
Yeah.
Not just the genetic load is huge.
They're assuming though that when a mutation happens, somehow it's going to make us better or more. More robust.
Again, the facts fly in the face. The evidence flies in the face of that every single time. Even C.S. Lewis back years ago said, I couldn't believe this. He was talking, mutations don't answer. They're either neutral or harmful for the most part. There's very few. And today we're using those same arguments. Lewis was right in the back in the early 50s.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
He's a smart guy.
He was a smart guy.
I heard that he sort of wanted to back off and not really address the evolution issue too head on, just so that he would not, hinder any of his apologetic.
Right. Originally, that's true.
Right. Yep.
In the later part of his life,
later he started to really be a little more vocal.
He took no prisoners, man.
Right.
I mean, he was wow.
So
Doug,
there's a slippery slope.
Yeah.
And the slippery slope is what Mr. Templeton sort of slid down.
Right, going back to his issue
he
of
wrote
losing faith.
He wrote Farewell to God, and had he been in a church that rejected the billions of years and actually it was shown the fallible nature of some dating methods, would he have actually written this? But I think what has happened is that the theologians seem to cave first because this is a subject too intimidating for them.
Yep.
That happens a lot, we find out. I've seen it in many. It was really sad in Templeton. I read the article when he was asked about Jesus Christ. He goes, "Oh, I miss him. He was the best friend I ever had." And I go, but he never turned back.
Right.
That is, and he was dying of cancer. I think he died of cancer or something. It was some because he died several years ago, and it was just so sad. It was just tragic.
Now, how do we know that Adam was a historic figure?
Well, the Bible makes it abundantly clear, I think, and the biggest argument for me, or the best and most important, is that Jesus Christ himself affirmed the Genesis account. He quotes from it in Matthew 19 and Mark 10 in reference to marriage and divorce, and he says, a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife, after reminding them, the Pharisees, who were in doubt over this whole thing and in confusion about.
But he says, he starts talking, haven't you read that at the beginning?
Haven't you read that's such a key phrase. Haven't you read? I mean, he's asking us that today. Haven't you read? God in the beginning made them male and female. And so, and he was referring to the two male-female couple, the couple that God created in the beginning, Adam and Eve, and there's no doubt about that. So Jesus Christ, if I was to make any argument for the historicity, the real, actual historicity of Adam and Eve, you just start from Jesus, and then the other New Testament writers corroborate that. Paul talks about Adam in Romans 5 and 1 Corinthians 15. He's mentioned in the book of Jude, and there are other places where he's alluded to as never in the New Testament is Adam treated anything but historical.
Well, I think the same people who question Adam also question Jesus.
Well,
Eventually.
they'll end up. Yeah, that may be the end. That's sort of the slippery slope that we talk about.
That's absolutely excellent, yeah, because that's what happens. You start one down, pretty soon there's a cascading effect of doubt that turns into apostasy. Of ultimately, usually what happens.
Well, I think the motivation may be you got people that seem like they want to have a good heart about this, and they want to say, okay, we know that evolution is a big issue, and we're really concerned that people are falling away from the faith because they don't think that they don't want to get in this argument. You know what I mean? They don't want to have this. But I think it was Al Mohler, Dr. Al Mohler, president of the Baptist Theological, I think it's Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and he said when you court the respect of the world, I'm paraphrasing, but when you court the respect of the world by compromising your beliefs, you will lose both your beliefs and the respect of the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so you can't have it. You
There's
can't have it both ways.
a quote from a book that I've got. It's called Bible in the 19th Century. And the guy says, the Bible can hardly be faulted for not compromising with error.
That was the other thing. By the way, Lewis said, he says an interesting thing. He says, those people who rely too much on scientific theories, what are you doing when that changes next week?
Right.
Or the next year? Or 10
Well, and
years
you see
down?
that now with epigenetics.
Absolutely.
And
you know?
with other things that are coming up, like all these variant dates for the inception of human beings into the fossil record, etc. The dates are going all over the place. I mean, what are the compromisers gonna do at that point? They're gonna change their Bible, go back to where they were before, or change again. I mean, it's like the Bible is the solid rock.
We're getting out of the end of this thing, so we want to wrap this thing up. So I want to. What was what would you like to leave the audience with?
Well, I think that just to remind everybody that the biggest issue are the theological issues. I think for the Christian.
Yes.
I mean, the scientific issues, they just match up. Like you said, we don't prove the Bible from science, but when good science is going to verify what we find in Scripture.
Yeah.
And when it comes down to the theological issues, the biggest one is Jesus and Adam and how they fit together in the Bible narrative. And so you have Jesus as the last Adam. Adam is the first man who brought sin into the world. Jesus is the last Adam who solves the problem of sin.
Right.
And
ultimately death and corruption.
And I just summarize it this way: God made a man, not a myth. Adam was a man, not a myth. And the real historical Adam is the source of the problem, which is sin, and the real historical Jesus is the solution to our problem. He's our salvation. And if you tamper with either, you're tampering with the whole of God's salvific enterprise in the world.
Yep, absolutely. Amen.
Well, hope you enjoyed our show tonight. We'll see you next time on Revolution Against Evolution.